Are we on? I guess we're on. I think we're on. We're not on. We are on. Okay. Well, thank you very much, whoever's here today. My name is Lee Pearson. I mentioned that because I didn't manage to get it plastered all over the announcement. So I get and I'm very happy here on the cutting edge to have Dr. Harry Binswanger as a co-discussant. We're not going to have a debate. We're just going to have a discussion. We are friendly. We disagree about some things. Sometimes we agree about most things, it turns out, I think. And we may agree on today's topic, which is there an integrating mechanism in the mind? We may agree more than I think. After we talk about it, we'll find out. Anyway, Dr. Binswanger, I don't like to do long introductions for anybody, but Dr. Binswanger, most of you, I'm sure, know about. I think just a couple of important things to know is about him is he is a philosopher who is the author of a book called How We Know, which I believe is maybe the only broad survey of issues of objectivist epistemology in a book that's ever been published. Isn't that true, Harry?
It's only book length treatment.
Book length. Yeah, I mean, obviously Ayn Rand wrote Introduction, I believe.
Yeah, but Greg Salmieri has things in the companion that are very worth reading. Looks like either you or I have frozen. We got internet problems here. Dylan, do you see Lee? Okay, well, I'll start talking till he comes back, because there's something I wanted to say that Lee is also a PhD, and he has taught for many years at Fairleigh Dickinson College in New Jersey. But more importantly, we've discussed, actually, I knew Lee a little bit in Columbia when I was in grad school, and he was an undergraduate in 1969-ish. But I reconnected with him in 1988 when he gave a lecture at an objectivist conference. We found that we were the only two people in the universe who did hard thinking about the nature of the mind and how it works. And we found a lot of agreement. Lee or Dr. Pearson, I will hope you'll call me Harry and I will call him Lee on this show. It's easier. He's if he appears on this show. If he doesn't, I'll tell you what he would have said. There he is. So he's given me a lot of helpful information and orientation based upon Gibson's work. I'm introducing you and me in our relationship.
Okay, all right.
And I've authorized Harry, and hope you will authorize Lee as the moniker for this discussion.
Oh, Harry and Lee. Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, Harry and Lee.
Yeah,
and so just to finish up, I wanted to thank you publicly, as I have in my book, for many helpful delousing of me in regard to traces of representationalism in my theory of my approach to perception. I have been greatly benefited by reading James J. Gibson, under whom Lee studied. He was a close, I don't know if you would say an associate, he was a premier student of Gibson's. Is that right, Lee?
I wouldn't say I was his last PhD student, but since I wasn't myself fundamentally interested in perception, I was a little bit out of the orbit for that reason. Now that's a topic for another day, talking about Gibson and perception. Yeah. But anyway, thanks for that. And I want to acknowledge you. You've been an inspiration to me over the years and sharpening my thinking about certain topics. For example, the nature of the subconscious versus the conscious mind, which I think I've always agreed. We've always been in agreement, but I think you make the point more sharply than I did about the subconscious is just that's the brain. That's what it is, or it's, let's say, a subset of the processes in the brain. It's physical, and that consciousness is not. And so, if that implies some form of dualism, make the most of it. You know, we don't have to admit Cartesian ghosts to be to assert that consciousness is not a material thing. Anyway, I've gotten a lot of inspiration from you over the years on that and other topics. But shall we go on?
Right.
Let me read the topic, today's topic, as I described it on Harry's list. Well, that's the other thing I was going to say is I was going to say two things: that you're the author of the one broad survey of objectives to epistemology in a book form, and that you're also the leader of a discussion list that discusses topics of all sorts, including topics of the sort we're talking today, the Harry Binswanger letter. Anyway, on that list, discussion list, I posted the topics. Let me just briefly read this because I think it's okay as a description. I said, for today's cutting edge, Monroe, Trout, and I view the function of consciousness to be entirely the volitional management of cognition and action. And I stress the word entirely. That's taken up in our paper, What is Consciousness For? But also I have a lecture on ARCUK entitled Consciousness as the Manager of Cognition and Action that goes into this in some detail. I'm going to give a
Lee froze up again. I thought I would be the one freezing because our internet has been very iffy. Okay, you're back. Muted. You're muted.
I'm not sure what's happening here, but somebody up there doesn't like us atheists. That's all I could say. And doesn't want anybody to know about how we know, for example.
I'm turning mine off.
Yeah, I would do that. Okay, yeah. I'm going to try to cut back on my research staff. Dr. Shoshana Milgram is on her own computer on the internet. I'm going to cut her off so that we make sure that we're not using any more bandwidth and elsewhere than we need to. Okay, so I was reading here, and so I mentioned that the lecture that I did for ARCUK would give a more extensive discussion of the kind of the underpinnings of the issue today. Now, Harry and Jean Binswanger view the function of the subconscious. See, I was talking about consciousness and what it does in entirely. Harry and Jean Binswanger view the function of the subconscious to be entirely reactive. And they have done a lecture on ARCUK, which I believe is entitled Reactive Subconscious, which you can find here, that will discuss that issue. But I'm going to ask Harry to give a brief description shortly, soon on that, to give us some context to work with. I think that the points to keep in mind here is that it's very important, the idea of it being only or entirely in both of our perspectives. The fact that I believe that consciousness is all about volitional control of action is what distinguishes what I have to say from, I think, all other theories that I'm aware of consciousness. There are many theories that postulate some kind of executive functioning for consciousness, very common. Most of those theories, however, are stolen theories because they deny or ignore free will, the majority of them. And those that don't, many of them have, the others have a laundry list of conscious functions. Consciousness does X, Y, and Z and a whole bunch of things, which I think many of which of those functions belong on the subconscious list. So that's how I differentiate myself. Similarly, I think there are many theories of the brain or the subconscious that say that the brain in some sense involves something like a database, some means of storage in some organized fashion. That's commonplace. What distinguishes Harry and Jean here, I think, and Harry can agree or disagree on this, is the idea that that's all the brain does with respect to consciousness. well, besides creating it. But as far as supporting consciousness, he doesn't, as I understand it, but again, Harry will amplify in a moment, shortly. The brain it doesn't do processing beyond what can be done just by moving things around in a database. But again, I'm going to let Harry amplify on that. So then I say on HBL, I said, given these perspectives, the two, my perspective on consciousness and their perspective on the subconscious, is there any place for an integrating mechanism of the mind? Because in my view, there's no place for it in consciousness. And in their view, there is no place for an integrating mechanism, at least not in Ayn Rand's sense of the term, which is something like a computer. There's no a place for it in the subconscious. And if it's not in the conscious, it's not in the subconscious, where is it as far as the mind is concerned? Obviously, you go outside the mind and consult the computer, but that would be a different thing. Okay, so what I thought I would do is give a little brief, as brief as I can make it, description of consciousness, the function of consciousness as a volitional manager. And then turn it over to Harry, and he can give his discussion however long he wants to, but I advise making it brief about the reactive subconscious, and then we can, from there, go into a discussion. So does that seem all right with you, Harry? You okay with that?
Yes, very
okay.
Good.
All right. So my view is that the and this is also, I think that's my view and Monroe Trout's in our paper, and I have expanded on it since then, is that the causal efficacy of consciousness is bound up entirely in volitional action. But ultimately, in an evolutionary sense, it's the volitional control of movement, but it also includes the volitional control of thought, because thought is extremely important and ultimately has to do with movement. So the volitional control of thought and movement, of cognition and action, is what the causal efficacy of consciousness is about. From that standpoint, conscious experience, things like consciously, emotions, sensations, pain and pleasure, the conscious experience of thoughts, those sorts of things are all passive. They do not themselves, in my opinion, affect anything else directly, have any effects and any direct effects. They matter. I'm not, as some people have charged me to be, I'm not an epiphenomenalist. I don't believe that thoughts and feelings and such have no causal significance, but they matter only because they inform and motivate volitional action. That's the reason. And all conscious experiences are proximately caused, as far as we know, by brain activity, probably mostly or entirely neural activity. Now, we don't know much about that. I sure don't know much about how that works, but it's pretty clear that that's true. And I think Harry agrees with me on that one, that the proximate cause of conscious experience, all conscious experiences, are neural activity. Now, that is an important point that we may come back to. So maybe an analogy is worth making here, just to try to make some things more, well, at least clarify some points. You can make an analogy to production in a company. Let's take Henry Ford and make an auto production. And Henry Ford is the manager, is the analogy to consciousness. He gives all the orders. And there are all these guys that work for him down there on the assembly line, or, in the case of consciousness, there will be many assembly lines, a whole bunch of them. And Henry Ford does not go down and do the work on the assembly line. Now, he could, and that's a difference between consciousness and material production in a company, but he could do it, but he doesn't. He gives the orders at sort of a high level, and then he may change the processes that people do from time to time, but he doesn't actually do the labor. In other words, in the analogy here, consciousness is management, the subconscious is labor. Now, this analogy breaks down, as I've already indicated here, in the sense that there's no little man in our head, in our consciousness. There's no what the fancy philosophers call a homunculus. There's no little man in the head that directs in consciousness that directs the axis of consciousness. So and whereas in the sense of a corporation, Henry Ford is a conscious being, and the guys down there in assembly lines are conscious beings, and they're all free agents. And that kind of free agency doesn't exist. Now, free agency exists in consciousness, but consciousness itself doesn't have a subconscious in consciousness. It's in the brain, and it has to deal with that. And so there's I think that turns out to be an important difference. But anyway, there's an analogy, and maybe that analogy is helpful. Another one we might think of is riding a horse. You ride on a horse. You've got your saddle and your bridle and everything. You can control a lot of what the horse does, but the horse does the running. You don't do the running. The horse does the running. If you get off the horse, now this is where Harry and I don't know how much we agree or disagree on this point as it would be applied to the human case. A horse by itself can run around and do things to a certain degree, but it can't run a race. You get out. That's why they have jockeys, because the horse isn't going to run a race. So you really can't get so much productive result from a horse unless you have a jockey. And the jockey is, again, the analogy to the conscious mind, and the horse would be the analogy to the subconscious. So so regarding today's issue, where's the integrative mechanism? Well, I guess I've already commented a little bit on that. I don't think there's any, I guess maybe I haven't. There isn't an integrating mechanism in consciousness. If there's a mechanism of that sort, if there is one, it's in the brain. That's the labor. That's where the machinery, of course, it's under the direction of consciousness, but you can't do it consciously. And I think introspection strongly confirms this. When you ask yourself what goes on in simple thought processes, or just take a simple memory process. So you ask yourself to remember something. Where did I put my car keys? If I put them somewhere that's not my usual place, and I might think about it for a while, and eventually it comes up, well, I put my car keys in a little bowl on the table. It's not my usual place, but that's where I put them. What I do in that process is I consciously ask the question, set the goal, but subconsciously answer it. And I can't tell you a lot. Maybe Harry can, we'll see. I can't tell you a lot by introspection about how the brain found that memory fact. I can't tell you that I walked down a corridor in the brain or went through a bunch of neurons and I turned left at this collection of neurons and I got to the spot where the thing about keys happens to be stored. Of course, it doesn't work that way anyway. But I don't have any knowledge of any sort of thing like that because we don't do that consciously. That is subconscious. So I think the distinction between management and labor is very strongly evident, I'm going to assert, in introspection. Okay, so I think that's enough to get my story going. So just one more thing. So I'm going to say there's no integrating mechanism in consciousness. The mechanism, obviously, consciousness is crucial to the overall process of integration, in the same way that a manager is crucial to the overall process of production. To deny that is to be a Marxist, in effect, with respect to the mind. So that's just wrong. It matters, but the actual labor, in the sense of workers working on an assembly line, I say is done by the brain. And whether you want to call that an integrated mechanism, well, that depends on how it's done. And I'm somewhat uncommitted on that point because I can't answer that by introspection. I can't really tell you what's going on, what actually is going on in the brain when I ask myself and answer questions. I can't answer that. Maybe Harry can, you see. But the usual answer, Ayn Rand's answer, for example, is that there's something like a computer down there. I'm not a fan of computer analogies, but they're so seductive. I do resort to it myself occasionally. There's something like down there that in the brain that's got something like a CPU and actually processes stuff and or maybe it's more like an internet, with a web crawler. And Harry says there's no web crawler down there in the brain. I'm not sure. I'm not sure why that's ruled out. So maybe he can address that point. But at the same time, if the assertion that Harry wants to make here is that there is integration, but it's done not by an integrating mechanism, but by, as a general rule anyway, by directed moving of elements around in a database. If he's saying something like that, I think I could go along. I don't know if it's true, but it certainly makes some sense to me. So maybe I better stop there and let Harry get into this. So go ahead, Harry.
Thank you. Incidentally, Dylan, can you make me co-host so I can share my screen? Because I have some old diagrams I can show. But I find it, first of all, kind of meta comment. Lee and I are both insistent on the importance for the history of civilization and the prolongation of it, that free will be accepted and that it be real free will, not compatibilist free will, which is a disguised form of determinism, not soft determinism, but that you have choices that are first causes in the universe. In other words, there's no necessitating, because there are preconditions and it's in accordance with your nature, but there's nothing that makes you think if you choose to think. So we're both extremely strong on free will. It's very important even for politics. We also both arrived independently at the metaphors and analogies that Lee gave you. The executive in his office and the people who report to him coming from below decks is something that I drew a picture of back when I was an undergraduate, and Lee arrived at it independently. So it must be true, because two minds wouldn't come up with.
But not at that time, because I was just a little kid when you were an
not
undergraduate.
At that time, no. But I never told anybody about it, so it's not that one of us is derivative from the other. Okay, that having been said, I think we disagree on some matters that have not been discussed, and the disagreement we have on matters that have been discussed, which is whether whether there's causality from conscious states down to the brain is not. I think Lee holds there is, and it's a subtle distinction. I'm not sure how important it is, so I'm not going to argue. I want to state what I think on the topic of the integrating mechanism. If you underline mechanism, then I don't believe there is any, or if there is, it's small and not very important. When Ayn Rand talks about the subconscious as an integrating mechanism, I see the basis for it, but I wouldn't call it a mechanism. In other words, I don't think the subconscious has a CPU, a central processing unit, that does things. It's very important to, that does things on its own. It's very important to establish that the conscious mind is the guider of what happens in the subconscious, and that the computer analogy is completely, it sounds patronizing if I say it's understandable, it made a lot of sense back when it was a UNIVAC. But now when we're familiar with hard drives and mass storage as opposed to random access memory and so forth, I liken the subconscious, the brain, to a hard drive. You put stuff on your hard drive. It could be in a database structure, as Lee suggests. I think that's a good analogy. But the brain, I do not believe, goes and finds connections for you. It can look like that, And people get all bent out of shape because they say, well, wait a minute, what about when Reardon combined the truss and the arch? And what about when the Kukli came up with the idea of the benzene ring? And there are all these kinds of connections that seem to be made when you're asleep. Well, there aren't all kinds. There's a few recorded cases that are very susceptible to other interpretations, and maybe something goes on. But basically, what happens is you concentrate on two things that you connect in your conscious mind, and they get associated in the brain. Physically, neural connections are made. Axons, dendrites grow to be near axons to form synapses. It doesn't necessarily happen in one experience. It might if it's very emotionally powerful. But certainly with the repetition, there's this saying, what fires together wires together. You're focusing on the connection between A and B stores in some way A with connections to B in the brain. Now, suppose you store A as connected to B, like zebras are mammals. And you learn at a certain point, and let's say you love horses and such, so you store that zebras are like horses, they're mammals. Then years later, you learn that mammals are distinguished from other animals by having their young born alive. And whereas other animals lay eggs, mammals bear their young alive. I know the duck-billed platypus is an exception, but I don't know why. So we'll put the duck-billed platypus aside. Okay, so now you've got zebra stored with mammal and mammal stored with young born alive. That doesn't mean that you automatically consciously recognize zebras bear their young alive and don't lay eggs. It's a very simple connection, but the fact that you've wired A to B and separately B to C means you're very likely, if they're well wired together, when the thought of A is stimulated, for the thought of B to be potentiated to enter into consciousness as well. Now, I'd like to show a little diagram. Let's see if I can share my screen. Yes, I can. So we'll go to advanced, and we'll go to portion of the screen. And I think I have to move this. Okay, now are you seeing, or it hasn't started sharing? Oh, it has. Are you seeing that blue-green diagram there, people? Lee?
Yes, I see it now. Yes,
okay.
I got it. Yeah.
All right, this is like I usually build up to this, but this is a confusing diagram. The white center, can you see my cursor moving around there?
Right, yes.
Okay, that white center is focal awareness. The orange surround is peripheral awareness. The fringe, oops, I erased something there, it's there. Fringe of awareness. Oh, I see, I have selected the eraser in Paint. Okay, peripheral awareness, not in awareness. In the brain, not in awareness, but could come into awareness. The further things are away from peripheral awareness, the less likely that thoughts of A are going to bring them into awareness. But B is just there as very strong links to A. B is practically in central foveal, we can call central awareness. And it's all set to come in. It's highly potentiated. On the other hand, F out here has one thin line to it, and it's not likely to come in. What comes in is what's triggered by what's already in there, plus how you move that central focus. You control where that focus goes, and you can if B interests you, you can choose to move it down to B, and then J will be highly potentiated rather than being way out here on the periphery, and maybe N will move to being in the periphery. What this means is that the brain works associationally, not by an index, not by addressing with a central lookup table, but the brain retrieves information, brings it into awareness. Of course, it's not information when it's not in awareness, but the potential information. It does it through association. Zebra, mammal. So mammal is ready to come in. Mammal, young born alive, ready to come in once B is in the focus of awareness. So there's no mechanism. You see, this explains how your thought can move from one topic to another without there being some organizer behind the scenes that is selecting things as if it were another mind and feeding you stuff. Rather, you control which of the things in the periphery that you're sort of somewhat aware of that you're going to focus on. When you focus on it, other things that are in the periphery you can bring to relate to it. The model doesn't show the kind of flexibility here, but when B comes to be the focus and N is in the periphery now, you can bring N into conjunction with B. When you focus on two things, oh, mammals, zebras bear their young alive, or I know about trusses and know about arches. There could be a truss-like arch or an arch-like truss. Then those two connect directly, and it's easy to bring them up together in one triggering event. The other things I want to talk about here, so there's no mechanism. There's just how you filed things, what impressed you, what you made a point of connecting. I've got to remember, zebras are mammals. I've got to memorize for the test the 5 characteristics of mammals. They have hair somewhere on their body, they bear their young alive, and I don't remember the other 3, but I was taught them. So you can control this storage. You can associate things more strongly, more weakly. You can go over it and over it like memorizing a poem. You can strengthen an association. And the other thing is triggering. What strikes you from the outside world and what's already in your focal awareness conditions what will come up next. The things that are most highly activated, like say the E here, well, the B, first of all. This has got a lot of psychic energy, so to speak. And so if left to its own, if you drop focus, B is going to come right in after A. The way I've drawn it, it's got the strongest links. But maybe B is irrelevant to your purpose at the time, because another thing you have always going in the periphery and re-entering is your purpose. What am I doing? So by bringing things logically connected into focal awareness, or moving your focal awareness to embrace them, it's relative, either way you want to say, you get the effect of an active subconscious or an integrating mechanism, but there isn't any. There isn't any. All the activity is done by the conscious mind. It establishes the structure of the database. It files the things in the database. Leah's right. We don't know how it does it, but we know that if you bring to, like right now, I'm going to bring together shoes and palm trees. Let's say sandals and palm trees to make it a little plausible. Now think of a palm tree with a pair of sandals at the bottom of it. And suddenly those sandals start on their own without being in anybody's feet, climbing up the tree as if it were walking. That's a pretty vivid image. You're likely to remember that if I said to you 6 months from now, What do you associate palm trees with from my lecture? You're likely to remember that because I made it vivid. You're in focus. I know you're all in focus. But it's not that your subconscious went out and made a new connection. The new connections come from what you do with your conscious mind to conjoin things and to see the connection that exists. All right, I talked for too long. I'm going to stop the screen share.
Okay, that's very good. I enjoyed that. I think I agree with it, except there are some things that are possibly equivocal. I want to tease out. When you say that when you consciously make connections between things, when people talk about things being done consciously, that is typically it typically involves equivocation, because sometimes they mean that you're aware of it. Sometimes they mean that consciousness does something unspecified automatically, or sometimes it means that you did it by volition. And I think there's even maybe another possible meaning that's not coming to my mind. But when people talks about things occurring consciously, they can mean one of several things, and they often slip around. I'm not accusing you of anything, by the way, Harry.
No, I think we agree on that it's attention. Yeah. It's attention.
There's actually an interesting article by a mechanist, materialist, cognitive psychologist named Velmans. And his article, the original article, he's written several on it, is called "Is Human Information Processing Conscious?" I think that was the title, something like that. And it's his theoretical perspective is very bad, but he does make this point about the usage of the term conscious that I think is correct. So anyway, to apply it here, when you say that you do something consciously and you make connections consciously, I'm all totally on board with that if you mean by that you volitionally order them to be made by the brain. But not if you mean that the consciousness itself is the labor guys down there in the assembly line. I don't buy that at all. If you mean volition.
Yeah.
So, and I don't think, so if we're talking in these cases, which are the cases you talked about, you focus on something and then you focus on something else, and that has effects. Basically, the way that works, this is discussed more in my lectures, or my talks with ARC UK, several of my talks, I've had 3, I think, that all get onto this topic, that volition holds something in mind longer than it would have otherwise been, and the result of that is that things get more material comes to mind about that element, whatever it is, drawn from experience or the world. That you active, in short, you activate more knowledge, but that's volitional. If we're in agreement that that's a volitional process and that it's basically directed, but that the labor, as it were, the process is still neural processing. See, all those connections you showed in that picture, some of those things are, I almost used a naughty word. I was going to say represented, but rather than say represented, let us say indicated. That's a better word. Indicated in consciousness, have indicators in consciousness. But all those connections are in the brain, every one of them, including the ones in focal awareness. And when you get a new connection made in your consciousness, the brain made that connection. Now, it came about by your ordering it to do so.
Yeah.
But it's not that the consciousness puts stuff together. I don't believe that ever happens.
If you want to get into the who does the work discussion, we can do that. But I don't think, I think that it's a matter of terminology. But I agree with you.
No, I think that's actually, it's an actual matter of reality. Is the brain doing it? Is the neural processes? Do neural processes cause all conscious experiences or not?
No, let's table that for the second. I'll get back to that.
Okay.
I realize now that there is a kind of equivocation in the lines that I've drawn there, because I haven't indicated whether they're neural or logical, or maybe psychological, conscious.
Or both, or all 3.
Yeah. And what I meant is that the things outside the orange circle are definitely neural. The things in the orange or the white circle are both neural and in consciousness. And what consciousness does to make a connection is just what you did when I said the story about sandals and palm trees. You drive your mind using your free will to attend to certain things. Now, some people maybe are here and are playing solitaire at the same time they're kind of half listening. They won't remember.
Probably are.
Right? So
Yep.
yes, it is the wiring is done by the brain. What the consciousness does is ramp up the heat, so to speak, turn on the light and supply the awareness side of it, intensify the awareness, which increases the likelihood that the item will be stored. The neural.
I'll buy that if you mean by turning on the light, you refer to agency in that connection. That is that we do that by volitional effort.
Yeah.
If that's what you mean, I'm perfectly
on board.
Although,
yes.
If you mean there's an automatic,
it can be automatic.
Done by consciousness.
It can be automatic.
I say no.
There is automatic attention. It doesn't loom large in their lives, but there are emotionally powerful events, and you remember the scene not because you used your free will, but you couldn't help but remember it. But those are not important. Huh?
I'd say all those kind of those automatized things are driven neurally. They result in consciousness. They're not the result of consciousness. They result in consciousness. All those automatic.
Let's say when I looked at the World Trade Center on fire before it fell, and you can't say World Trade Center to me without that image coming to mind.
Right.
That's because of the conscious experience that I was having, had the energy to, fuse that into my brain.
I say this is where we disagree. See, finally we have got it down. I say the exact opposite of that. The neural processes created both the conscious experience that you had and the neural persistence, whatever that thing that Lashley called an engram, whatever that is, and we know somewhat more about it now, but not.
You don't think it goes up?
That was created at the same time by the brain. It's not a loop. No. What happens is when you have the experience, when you have the material coming in, the same neural processes that cause the conscious experience are involved in laying down the physical potential for re-experiencing, in other words, the memory.
But that's
both
not
of those
the
things
important
are involved. There is absolutely no need and no reason to postulate an effect coming back down from the conscious experience.
Well, then you are an epiphenomenalist and a mechanist.
Oh, no. Remember, these are tricky issues. So it's easy to think that, but it's not true because you could say this much. I think conscious experiences are epiphenomenal at that instant, and they don't cause anything in the brain, but they're very important because they guide your volitional action. They provide guidance and motivation for volitional action. If you didn't have conscious experience, you wouldn't want to do anything volitionally, and you wouldn't know where to direct your attention volitionally. So they're very important, but they're not important in directly changing the brain. It's totally unnecessary. The neural processes that created the conscious experience are also involved in laying down the memory, and there's nothing added by having the conscious experience come back down. If there's intensity in the conscious experience, that intensity is already existing in the underlying neural processes. It's already there. So there's no need for that.
I don't even know what that means
whatsoever, and there's no reason to think. No. So I'll give you you've heard this example before, but there's a simple example. The things we're talking about are much more complicated, but the simple example is a person might think that when they put their hand, he puts his hand or she puts her hand, when the person puts his or her And on a hot stove, when you pull it away, you might say, "Oh, I felt the hot stove and pull it away." But we know that's not true. We know that's false,
Yeah,
because that's
right.
the spinal reflex. I'm saying that we have the same. We're in the same situation with respect to other actions
But that's a
of conscious
spinal
experience.
reflex. There's a
Yeah, but
spinal
I think
reflex.
that's a case where we know it. I'm just giving that as an example to show that
Yeah.
does not follow merely because you have some input and you have a conscious experience. It does not follow from that necessarily in any way at all that the conscious experience causes any memory from it. There's no necessary connection between those things, and I think it's quite the opposite. That the simpler explanation, the one that we have evidence for, is that as I just said, the same neural processes that produce the conscious experience also are at least involved in laying down the physical trace that we call memory. You don't need the conscious experience.
What's the role for free will? What's the role for free will?
Well, free will is, again, you hold something in mind longer than it would have been without free will. You hold, whatever your conscious experience is, you hold that in mind, and that does act down in the brain. Of course, it causes there to be neural processing that would not have existed without the volitional action.
But then you're saying what's in the mind does control what the brain does.
Yes, volitional one thing and one thing only: volitional effort. That's in the mind, the conscious mind. It is specifically volitional effort that has downward causation on the brain. That's
well, then that seems like an artificial division, that you say that if you choose to hold in mind A's relationship to B, that affects the brain. But if you have an intense experience about A and B, that doesn't do anything to the brain.
That is correct, because that intense experience. Wait a minute. Here's why. It's simple. That intense experience was proximately caused already by neural processes. Volitional actions, volitional effort is not caused by neural activity, or at least it can't be. But conscious experiences are. That's the difference. Anyway, that's my view.
Okay, but that's an area of profound disagreement.
Yeah, someday you'll get it, though.
I don't think so. Unless dementia takes over, yeah.
Dementia takes over.
Okay.
Well, I think it makes perfect sense, but I'll grant you this much: it's a little, how should I put it, counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's just what I was going to say.
Or as you said, you said it was too radical, but I'm okay with radical. I'm all in favor of radical.
The more radical it is, the more I want it. If it's radical,
well, this is definitely radical.
No, I think it's insufficiently radical.
Nonsensical. Again, I think if you think of the example, I'm asking the group in general to think of this example of pulling your hand away from a hot stove, because I think there's the common sense impression would be that indeed you pull your hand away because you felt you had a conscious experience of pain or heat and pain, but that is simply not true. And I'm just extending that and saying it's not true in the other cases either. Now we know it's not true in that case because it's a simple case.
Yeah,
the other case is
more the spinal reflex. The neural reflex arc.
That's right. I know, but you got to take my point. My point is that people are apt to think.
People are apt to think. Yeah, but if you've ever done that,
because they feel the heat, they pull their hand away. That is not correct. That is not you can't infer that.
If you've actually had that happen, and I haven't had it happen on the stove, but I've had to think, where that happens, and it's not at all clear to me that I'm feeling the pain first. It seems like before anything could happen, my hand flew up.
I guarantee you that many people have that impression.
Yeah, when you think about it, but if you introspect.
That's the sort of impression that we have about our conscious experiences and our automatic actions. And I'm saying that impression is not, if you describe it accurately, if you do your introspection really well, your introspection should be that, or is that, at least mine is, one thing happens and the other thing happens, and they're very closely conjoined in time. Not that one thing caused the other.
Talking
Not
about,
that one thing caused the other.
we can't
Yeah.
introspect the interaction of the two. We can't introspect.
That's correct.
How does the being impressed with something change the brain? We infer that. All right.
Yes, that's correct. That is exactly right. But I think people tend to I'm going to be charitable to the world, humans. They're not all just terrible introspectors, but they're not as careful as they could be. I think a careful introspection would say that the two things occur: your reaction and the conscious experience conjoined in time, but you don't really know from that what the causality is. And I'm saying that's the same condition in these other cases, all the cases of conscious experience.
We know
there is a certain conjoining. We do not know the causal just from introspection. We don't know the causation.
It's possible, Lee, that we're both wrong. It's possible that
that's always possible.
I'm not talking about metaphysically possible, but it might be that you can't prize apart the neural and the conscious at a certain level. That we tend to think of, well, the neural happens and then bang, the conscious happens. But it may be that the neural is the physical side of the conscious, so that this dispute doesn't even really arise, because there's a neural side of recognizing, being impressed with, giving orders to yourself to remember that it's both conscious and neural, so that
I'll tell you why I think that's
possible.
Wrong. Huh? I think that's wrong, though. I mean, it's a possibility, and it's an interesting.
I'm not
subtle.
saying it. I'm not saying it, but I consider it as a hypothesis.
Okay, I'll tell you why I think that's not right. But some aspect of that could be right, I suppose. But we know that there are nociceptors. Neurons that respond. Nociceptors. 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 These are neurons that respond to various kinds of tissue damage. They do not necessarily result. Some are involved in the conscious experience of pain. Some are not. Some nociceptors just result in some kind of response. So there is, in fact, even neurologically, a separation between the neural activity, at least some of the neural activity, and consciousness. There are a lot of things that are done regulatory, regulatory that are not conscious. For example, balance is basically a cerebellar, is primarily a cell mediated by cerebellar neurology. I'm not an expert on this. But it's not conscious. We're not aware of that, and but it is based on perceptual input. So there is you can separate out those things. You can't do it.
Suppose we say horse racing is something that horses do. And then you say, well, look, there's a lot of things that horses do. We know there are things that horses do, like pulling a plow, that isn't horse racing. Yeah, but some things that horses do are horse racing, and there's no horse dichotomy. And so it might be, I'm not pushing this, but it might be that certain kinds of neural activity of a very definite sort are simultaneously conscious, and that we make too much of a distinction between the neural and the conscious. But then, the question of free will then enters in there. If it's also a neural process, how can it be volitional? But I think don't you think that's a wrong question? That it begs the question, like, why couldn't it be volitional?
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think there's consciousness in the brain, or not. Consciousness arises from the brain, but it's not identical to the brain.
Yeah, we definitely agree.
Volition can have an effect. Now, I guess if you're if we, you see, it's what happens when you bring a philosopher on. If you bring in this fancy identity theory of the inseparability of conscious express, maybe it's not exactly an identity.
It's not an identity.
Dual aspect,
dual
sort
aspect.
of a dual aspect.
Dual aspect.
Dual aspect.
Mm-hmm.
If you bring it, I think it still is the case that even there, it would still be the case. I'm not sure about this. We're kind of in murky territory here. I would say it'd still be the case, as far as I can see at this moment, that you wouldn't be saying that the conscious experience is causing neural processes, because they are dual aspect. They're aspects of the same thing under this view. So it's a different kind of a theory than consciousness affects the brain. So even there, what I would say is, if that's true, let's say it's true that there's a dual aspect to this situation. I would say the dual aspect is not causal; it's identity, but volition is still causal. So I'm still coming back to is that the causal efficacy we're talking about here is volitional. Coming back to that, even under a dual aspect. How do you like that one?
I like it. I like it.
That's the best I could do.
Okay.
Under the pressure of the moment.
These are ideas that we don't have answers to the mind-brain relationship.
But let's say I'm going to just say one more thing, and we got a minute or two here, if I can. Or give me a minute, quick minute. When I think about the reactive subconscious theory in light of what I believe, so I don't think it necessarily contradicts. It does not have to contradict my view that if you phrase it right and get rid of any possible equivocations, it does not have to contradict my view that the causal efficacy of consciousness is volitional, because it's volition that moves the things around, that does all that moving around in the database. Right. Now, whether it's true or not, I would my best.
Oh, I get a chance to talk now. No, it's true. The model is compatible with either of the positions. You're muted.
I got cut off at the cliffhanger there. My best estimate at this time would be it's an empirical question, because maybe you could say a word. This is a pressure. Why do you think that your view, given that the computer view, the CPU view, can be developed to explain things that go on subconsciously, at least at the hand waving stage that we're at? Why do you think that? Do you think it's ruled out? What rules that computer view out? What makes it not a possible view in your estimation?
That the subconscious is a mechanism that forms connections.
Is a mechanism that is active in the sense of a computer, which, by the way, does not have agency. A computer does not have agency. Right. There's no free will in a computer. So you have to go beyond that, which I'm sure you can.
It's a burden of proof issue. Since everything can be explained without hypothesizing a CPU being in there, it's gratuitous to hypothesize it.
Yeah. Okay.
Shoshana.
The actual chat box. Can I get the actual chat box? Yes.
Yeah.
No, wait a minute. I've got.
Hey, Levy. You want me to read them to you? The first one's
Gene
go ahead.
Walters. Yeah.
Any thoughts on the modularity of mind? In quotes. Could distinct competing modules have evolved to link and create the ability to integrate? That's you.
All right, I'll I got to be brief here, right? There could be something. The general thesis of the modularity of mind is wrong. As a general thesis, and the way it's held by most evolutionary psychologists is that the mind is a Swiss Army knife with a whole bunch of different specific capabilities, and that's all it is. Now, my view, which is not totally settled in this area, but I would say that is impossible. That cannot be true, because we have a reason which is volitional, that has.
He's down again. All right, let me take one. How could we possibly distinguish Harry and Lee's stances on causal direction without a lot more detailed understanding of the causal mechanism. You can do it. You don't need a detailed understanding of the causal mechanism. You can, Lee's view is that what you perceive, for instance, does not have any effect on your body. Or is that, except as it would influence the conceptual faculty?
Well, volition. Let's not open that one up. Let's just say the conscious experience is affected us via volitional action, via volitional attention. That's how conscious experiences affect us. I guess
so
we're about at the point.
Cases. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Was there something else, Dylan? Was there another one?
Yeah.
Something else?
Yeah, I was reading them.
Yeah.
Ray physical, Shay Levy says, Ray physical and mental being two sides of the same action. If so, I lean towards this. We need radically new kinds of laws. You mean metaphysical laws for the nature of physical action for volition. Can I speak to that as a philosophical?
Yeah, do it.
Okay. Yeah, one thing that infects the whole mind-body discussion in philosophy is a parochial view of what physics is. There's no way to say that the physics is entirely known, and it's 19th century physics. We already have things that don't fit the 19th century model. I don't think they're well understood. They're improperly conceptualized. Quantum mechanics is improperly conceptualized, but the billiard ball model is not the end of physics. So there's no way to rule out a existence of other forms of what will come to be called physical laws, but which are not known now and will become apparent when we study the most complex thing in the universe, the human brain. So, don't assume you know what physical is, and don't assume that it's equivalent with Newton's mechanics.
Sounds good. I mean, when people talk about these things, that they usually when they talk about the causal closure of the physical.
Yeah.
If you press somebody, they'll say, well, in terms of the current laws of physics, because otherwise it's pretty meaningless. Pretty meaningless to talk. And in terms of the current laws of physics, I would say that the causal closure of the physical is definitely not a known fact.
Yeah. And let me just add to that. Let me just add one thing. Our extrapolation of physics to consciousness has to square itself with what we know about consciousness. It is not the case that consciousness has to square itself with somebody's extrapolation of 19th century physics to the brain.
Or any other physics.
Or any other physics. It's an axiom. You cannot deny I am conscious. You cannot deny I have free will. It's self-refuting.
Did we get all the super chats there? I wanted to add one thing about the modularity. Could there be some modularity to the mind? Yes, I think it probably could be, but it can't be. I think it isn't the Swiss Army knife that the evolutionary psychologists claim it is. And one of the reasons they claim this is because they don't have any concept of free will, those people, for the most part. That's why they come up with these. The mind is a bunch of very specific adaptations. But could there be specific adaptations? Yes. Could there be modules in the brain? Yes.
Do you agree with me that evolutionary psychology, if it's evolutionary human psychology, is ruled out as invalid?
Probably not. But I'll tell you what, that's a good thing for a segue. First of all, we will have another cutting edge, but not in 2 weeks, because I'm going to be at a conference with Shoshana. We're going to be speaking at the Social Science History Association. Oh boy, are we going to have fun with them. And I'm going to have some epistemological fun with those guys. But anyway, 3 weeks, we'll have something, but I don't know what yet on the cutting edge. So we are now, with the evolutionary psychology issue, is probably good to segue. We're going to go over to Clubhouse. and have a free discussion about these matters. So let's stop things now and go back. Harry, you ready to go too?
Yeah, if I can do it.
Okay. All
I'm
right.
not sure I
See
can.
everybody later. Thank you
Bye.
very much for coming. But come to Clubhouse if you can.